Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here. This is my revised take on Frozen Orb for Season 5 of Diablo IV. I'm going to be covering a no mythic, relatively easily accessible version of the build that speed farms tier 100 pits in around 2 minutes, and does tier 110 pits in about 3 minutes. It can do tier 7s, it's really fast in the overworld, and pretty good for gauntlets as well. Having said that, there will be a few mythic variations in the build planner which are even tankier and still pump out the damage, able to clear tier 8 hordes and up to at least tier 125 pits, although not very time efficiently. If you like build guides like these, please leave a like, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment for the YouTube algorithm. It is much appreciated, thanks a lot, and now let's get to the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to be taking 2 into Firebolt. We're going to take 5 into Frozen Orb, of course, and go for the Greater Frozen Orb. Then we'll take 1 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance. In our defensive skills, we'll take 1 into Flame Shield, 2 into Teleport, and go for the Shimmering Teleport. We'll take 3 in Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for the Shimmering Ice Armor. In our Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, and go for the Summoned Ice Blades, take 1 into Lightning Spear, go for the Invoke Lightning Spear, then we'll take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Align the Elements, for that 3 into Mana Shield, and 3 into Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're just taking 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 in Devouring Blaze. Then in our ultimate skills, we're going to be taking 3 into each of these: Permafrost, Hoarfrost, Frigid Breeze, and Icy Touch. And finally for our key passive, we're going to be taking Via's Mastery here. Next up for the enchantments, we're going to be going for the Frozen Orb enchantment as our first, so whenever we cast a non-basic skill, such as Frozen Orb, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And our second enchantment is going to be the Firebolt enchantment, so direct damage from skills applies burning damage over 8 seconds, and this will be used to proc Devouring Blaze, and also our Flame Feeder glyph. Next up we have the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon Board, we're going to be using 8 glyphs here, and in our starting board we're going to start with the Elementalist glyph, so dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. For our second board, we're going with the Enchantment Master board, and we're using the Unleash glyph. So after spending 50 mana, we deal 8% increased damage and gain 25% increased mana regen for 3 seconds. For our third board, the Burning Instinct board, we're going to be using the Tactician glyph. So we deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. This duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on the action bar. For our fourth board, we're going to be using the Icefall board, making sure we take the legendary node here. So Frost skills will deal 25% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and this bonus is doubled if the enemy is also frozen. As for the glyph, we're using the Winter glyph. So whenever we chill or freeze an enemy, we deal 4% increased cold damage for 10 seconds, and that will stack up to 18%. For our fifth board, we're going with the Frigid Fate board, again taking the legendary node. So we deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 20% of the total amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to 60%, which is what we will have. And for the glyph, we're going to be using Flame Feeder here, so we deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies, as well as some extra damage to burning enemies. For our sixth board, we're going to be using the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to be using the Destruction glyph, so we get a lot of critical strike damage here, and on top of that, critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. For our seventh board, we're going to be going with the Searing Heat board, and we're going to be using the Exploit glyph here, so that gives us vulnerable damage, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. And for our 8th and final board, we're going to be going for the Elemental Summoner board, and our glyph will be Conjurer. so we get some conjuration damage, but more importantly, our conjuration skills have 20% increased duration. So that's it for the Paragon board. If I went too fast for you, don't forget to check the build planner in the description below, as that's going to have everything in it. The Paragon board, the gear, the skills, etc. So have a look at that to go at your own pace. Next up, we have the gear. So for the gear, I'm going to list the affixes and masterworking you would want on the left side of the screen. Again, I'm just going to be listing off the standard build here. There will be mythic variations in the build planner in the description below, so make sure you check that out. So starting with the helm, we're going to be using a Godslayer crown. That gives all stats, max life, damage to elites, and cooldown reduction. Also, when we stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite, we pull in all nearby enemies and deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds, occurring once every 12 seconds. And against bosses, this effect triggers when we deal damage. If you don't have a Godslayer crown, you would use a normal helm with cooldown reduction, intelligence, and max life. Temper that with warmth and lucky hit % chance to immobilize. As for the aspect, you would want to use something like Snowveiled, so casting ice armor makes you unstoppable and grants 25% damage reduction for 3.5 to 5 seconds. And as for the masterworking, for both of these helms you would want to masterwork the cooldown reduction. Next up we have the chest piece. We're going to be using a normal chest piece with intelligence, armor, and mana per second if possible, and you would want to temper that with total armor and lucky hit % chance to freeze. As for the aspect, you would use the aspect of Everliving here, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies, and you would want to masterwork the intelligence or the mana per second, depending on whether or not the mana per second is a greater affix or not. Next up, we have the gloves. So we're going to go for normal gloves with attack speed, critical strike chance, and ranks into Frozen Orb, and we're going to temper that with lucky hit % chance to stun, and critical strike damage. As for the aspect, we're going to be using the aspect of Frozen Orbit, so Frozen Orb explodes 2 additional times at its destination for 45 to 60% of its damage. And for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the ranks into Frozen Orb. Next up we have the pants. We're going to be using Tybalt's Will. That gives us all stats, max life, max resource, and damage reduction while unstoppable. We also deal 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after. Also, when we become unstoppable, gain 50 primary resource. So for Tybalt's Will, we're going to be trying to masterwork that max life. If you don't have access to Tybalt's Will, then you would use some normal pants with intelligence, max life, and something like resist all or armor. As for the tempering, you would temper that with warmth and crowd control duration, and you would masterwork the intelligence. As for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of concentration. So casting a conjuration skill grants you 15 to 25% damage reduction for 5 seconds. Alternatively, you could also use something like Mage Lords, so the Veer's Mastery Key passive also grants you 6 to 9% damage reduction, tripled while fighting a close enemy. Next up we have the boots. We're going to be going for Essu's Heirloom. That gives us a bunch of movement speed after killing an elite, critical strike damage, and resist all. Also, your critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 40% of your move speed bonus. So that is a really good aspect. That gives you a lot of critical strike chance. And we are going to try and masterwork the critical strike damage. If you don't have access to these boots, you would use boots with intelligence, movement speed, and max life. You would temper that with teleport cooldown reduction and crowd control duration. And for the masterworking, go with the intelligence. As for the aspect, you would want to use something like the aspect of the Bounding Conduit, so teleport's cooldown is reduced by 1 to 2.5 seconds, and after teleporting, crackling energy hits 2 additional enemies for 5 seconds. Next up we have the main hand weapon. We're going to be looking for a wand here, and we're going to be wanting one with intelligence, critical strike damage, and max life. As for the tempering, go for Frozen Orb chance to cast twice, and critical strike damage. For the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the chance for Frozen Orb to cast twice. As for the aspect, we're going for Storm Swell here. That will let us deal 15 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up we have the offhand. We're going to look for something with intelligence, critical strike chance, and cooldown reduction, and we're also going to temper that with chance for Frozen Orb to cast twice, and critical strike damage. As for the masterworking, same as the main hand, we're going to try and masterwork chance for Frozen Orb to cast twice. For the aspect, we're going to use Conceited here, so we deal 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. Alternatively, if you want, you could use Accelerating, so critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 10 to 25% for 5 seconds. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going for a Fractured Winterglass here. This is pretty essential for this build. This will give us non-physical damage, chance for Frozen Orb projectiles to cast twice, Conjuration cooldowns reduced when a Frozen Orb explodes, and ranks into Conjuration Mastery. As for its unique aspect, casting Frozen Orb has a 35 to 65% chance to spawn a random Conjuration when it explodes, and on lucky hit your Conjurations have up to a 50 to 90% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at nearby enemies. So this synergizes really well with the build and helps to tie it all together. For the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the Conjuration Mastery. And if you don't have access to a Fractured Winterglass, you would use a normal Amulet with Conjuration Mastery, attack speed, and cooldown reduction or critical strike chance. As for the tempering, you would temper that with crit damage, and Ice Blade or Lightning Spear cooldown reduction. And for the aspect, you would move Frozen Orbit from your gloves to the Amulet. And on the gloves you could put on the Accelerating aspect. Next up we have the rings. We're going for Talrash's Iridescent Loop as our first ring. That gives us lucky hit chance, non-physical damage, cooldown reduction, and ranks into potent warding. Also, for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 80%, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes these bonuses. So obviously a staple ring for sorcerers, and we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction. For our second ring, we're just going to be using a standard ring with intelligence, attack speed, and critical strike chance. As for the tempering, we'll temper it with critical strike damage, and if possible, Ice Blades or Lightning Spear cooldown reduction. As for the masterworking, you would want to try and masterwork the attack speed. For the aspect, we're going with the aspect of Shredding Blades here, so Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerables increased by 20%, and the duration will be increased by 4 seconds. You also gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage. Now if you don't have access to Talrash's, you would use a second one of these rings with intelligence, attack speed, and crit chance, temper it the same way, and for the aspect, you would use whatever aspect you didn't use on your focus. So in our case we would put on the Accelerating aspect. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, we're going to go with 1 diamond and 2 skulls in the jewellery. We're going to go for the emeralds in the weapon and offhand. And we're going to go for a mix of topazes and rubies in the armour, although you could do either or there. So that wraps up the build. Thanks a lot for watching. Hope you guys get something out of this. If you did enjoy, please leave a like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, it helps out the channel a lot, and leave a comment telling me what your favourite build's been this season. I'll leave you with some more Frozen Orbing, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!